What if I told you the man who built one of the richest cities in the world started with no resources, no natural wealth, and got kicked out of his own country? This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Singapore and the iron-willed man behind it, Lee Kuan Yew. In the 1960s, Singapore was a muddy, chaotic port. No army, no water, no oil, just people, and one man with a vision. Lee Kuan Yew said, "In 10 years, this will be a metropolis." Most laughed, but he didn't need their belief. He needed their discipline. Lee wanted unity. He believed Singapore and Malaysia were one. But politics turned hope into heartbreak. On August 9th, 1965, Singapore was expelled. Lee cried on national TV, not out of weakness, but because he knew what came next would test every fiber of his people. He said it himself, "This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine." Lee wasn't here to play politics. He was here to survive, to build, to lead. And he'd do it with discipline, fearlessness, and yes, with iron in his soul. Singapore had no army, so Lee created one. Mandatory conscription, training camps, marching in heat and mud. He said, "We may be small, but we will be sharp." And that's how Singapore learned. You don't need size to be strong. You need spirit. After independence, global economists whispered, Singapore won't last 5 years. No land, no minerals, no allies. But Lee didn't flinch. He told them, "Watch us turn this mudflat into steel." And brick by brick, factory by factory, Singapore defied gravity. Lee didn't govern for popularity. He wasn't thinking in election cycles. He was thinking in centuries. He once said, "I calculate for the next 100 years. That's how he built systems that lasted even when they hurt in the moment. Sacrifice now, stability later. In 1980, airline pilots staged a strike mid-flight. They thought they had the upper hand. Lee summoned them and said, "You're playing with fire. I will teach you a lesson you'll never forget." Discipline wasn't negotiable, not in his Singapore. Singapore once ran on bicycles and barefoot feet. Then came the MRT. It wasn't just trains. It was a symbol of speed, of modernization, of a city that once had no future, now racing toward tomorrow. As wealth grew, so did comfort. But Lee warned, don't let comfort make you weak. Singaporeans lived in high-rise towers now, worked in air-conditioned offices, but behind every soft chair he wanted a backbone of steel. In 1985, Lee Kuan Yew stood before the U.S. Congress, not as a beggar, as a peer. He warned America, protectionism shrinks jobs, leadership demands responsibility. It wasn't just about trade, it was about respect. Singapore, once ignored, was now advising superpowers. The Singapore River once stank with sewage and rot. Lee made a bold promise. We'll clean it in 10 years. Factories were moved, vendors relocated, and the river became a mirror of the nation, polluted in the past, but reborn through willpower. In 1979, Lee launched the National Courtesy Campaign, Be Polite or Be Left Behind. It wasn't just about kindness. It was social survival. In crowded cities, small habits prevent big breakdowns. Even a simple thank you was seen as national policy. Even after stepping down in 1990, Lee didn't disappear. He became minister mentor, watching, advising. He said, "You don't choose your parents, but we can raise a nation's children to be stronger." He wasn't just building policies, he was building people. 2003. The SARS virus hit hard. Hospitals filled. Streets emptied. Fear returned. But Lee, even in old age, reminded the nation, "We've faced darker days. We'll stand again." Crisis didn't weaken Singapore. It reminded people what they were made of. At 80, Lee heard whispers. "Singapore's best days are behind." He replied, "The party isn't over. The music hasn't stopped." While others doubted, he doubled down. He believed in recovery, in reinvention, because for him, the future was something you built, not something you feared. In 2004, Lee's son, Lee Hsien Loong, became prime minister. But the elder Lee stayed nearby, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. He knew a great leader doesn't just lead, he lets go, so that the fire he lit can burn in others. Foreign investors didn't come for beaches, they came for trust. Singapore was clean, fast, predictable, because Lee made sure of it. No corruption, no shortcuts, he said. In a region of chaos, he built a sanctuary of order, one contract at a time. Some called him a machine, cold, calculating. But listen closely. He was a man who cried on camera, who wrote letters to grieving families, who walked his ill wife around gardens long after she forgot his name. Strength wasn't stone, it was love, with discipline. In 2015, Lee Kuan Yew passed away. Singapore wept, not for a politician, but for a founder. He built a nation from mud, guided it with steel, and left it standing like a monument to willpower. He didn't just lead Singapore, he became it. Lee believed in pragmatism, not ideology. He asked, "What works for my people?" Not what pleased the West, not what won applause. He called democracy a means, not an end. And he proved a system, if just and clean, could earn loyalty without loud slogans. Singapore is called the Lion City. But Lee wasn't the lion's roar. He was its spine, unseen, silent, unbending. He didn't chase headlines. He chased results. While others performed, he prepared. And in a noisy world, discipline made more noise than drama. Lee once said, "Train the mind or be left behind." Education was his obsession. Libraries opened. Schools expanded. From kampung huts to elite universities, he made knowledge the new currency. Singapore didn't dig for oil. It mined mines. Lee said a leader must do 3 things: act firmly, plan succession, and leave with grace. He did all 3. When others clung to power, he bowed out, but stayed watchful. Because real leadership isn't about being seen, it's about being trusted. Lee's legacy isn't in statues, it's in order. Clean streets, fast trains, trust in the system, every efficient hospital, every safe street, every scholarship. They whisper the same name, even if no one says it aloud. Singapore doesn't just remember him, it lives him. They called it the Singapore Miracle. From swamp to skyline in 1 generation. But Lee rejected the word. There was no miracle, he said. There was work. Behind every glowing GDP figure were sleepless nights, unpopular policies, and citizens who didn't give up. Western media often labeled him authoritarian. Lee didn't argue. He simply asked, "Is your city safer than mine? Is your system cleaner?" He measured success not in headlines, but in homes built, schools opened, and jobs created. World leaders listened when Lee spoke. Deng Xiaoping asked for advice. Margaret Thatcher praised his mind. Kissinger called him a teacher of statesmen. Singapore was tiny, but Lee made it matter. Because the strength of a nation isn't its size, it's its clarity. In 2014, Lee attended his last National Day parade. His face was thin, his walk slow. But when the anthem played, he stood without help. Because patriotism to him wasn't performance, it was instinct. Today's world feels chaotic, divided, distrustful. But Lee's story whispers something timeless. Start with discipline, lead with clarity, end with grace. Because nations aren't built on noise. They're built on character, quiet, enduring, and unshakable. In a time when the West ruled ideas, Lee showed the East had its own path. He wasn't anti-West. He was post-West. He believed Asian values, discipline, family, duty, could build a future just as powerful without copying anyone. Lee didn't jail his enemies. He jailed the corrupt, even top officials. He said, if you want to lead, your hands must be clean. And so Singapore grew, not just in wealth, but in trust. Lee feared not war, not death, but decay. He once said, the moment Singapore becomes soft, we are finished. He didn't fear foreign threats. He feared internal rot, complacency, entitlement, because empires collapse, not from the outside, but from within. Lee kept his meetings short, his speeches shorter. He once told a minister, why are you still talking? Efficiency wasn't just policy, it was personality. Because every second lost was a brick unlaid in the city he was building. Leadership is lonely. Lee knew it. He made hard decisions few would dare to defend. He said, if you want to be loved, don't go into politics. But he didn't need love. He needed results, and that made all the difference. When he buried his wife, he didn't give speeches, just silence. But a note was found in his drawer. I have lived a full life. I loved her deeply. Even iron has a heartbeat. Even builders feel the weight of goodbye. Power doesn't impress Lee. Stability does. He once said, I want a system so strong it won't break when I die. That's why he built institutions, not cults. Because the test of leadership is what happens after you're gone. Lee's words were like weapons, sharp, short, and surgical. No fluff, no performance, just direction. In crisis, people didn't want poetry. They wanted orders, and he gave them with precision. Lee rarely shouted, but when he spoke softly, everyone leaned in. Because real strength doesn't need volume. It needs clarity. In a world of noise, he proved silence can shape nations. In the end, Lee didn't need final speeches. His country was his speech. His silence was louder than applause. His systems worked. His people stood tall. And somewhere in every Singaporean heartbeat, you still hear his rhythm. Lee once said, I plan in 50-year blocks, not for applause, but for endurance. He didn't chase quick wins. He engineered systems meant to last longer than memory. Because real leadership isn't about being remembered. It's about being repeated. To Lee, Singapore wasn't a story. It was a company. He hired on merit, fired on failure, promoted efficiency. He treated ministers like CEOs. Results were everything. The board, the people, and quarterly performance, national survival. He believed in fear, not to dominate, but to protect. He said, if you're not afraid of failing, you will fail. To him, fear wasn't weakness, it was wisdom, the start of humility and the fuel for discipline. He hated drama. Singapore, he said, must never be noisy. No gossip, no scandal, no distraction. Not because he feared free speech, but because he feared wasted energy. While other nations burned with noise, he built with focus. He turned Singapore into more than a city. It became a signal to the world that small nations could lead, that clean streets could mean strong minds, that tiny places could make giant moves, not in size, but in certainty. Lee often said less than expected, but every pause was packed with pressure. He believed silence could lead, because silence made others think, and thinking was his strongest tool. Few know this. Lee once considered stepping down. Early, the pressure, the weight, the hate. But a walk in the gardens cleared his mind. He said, "If I don't stay the course, who else will carry this burden?" And so he carried it. Lee didn't run workshops. He didn't write self-help books. But he taught through action. When his ministers came late, he waited without complaint, then cut their department's budget. Message received. You see the towers, the trains, the growth, but you don't see the nights, the lonely decisions, the rejections, the times he said no to comfort, to shortcuts, to applause. Because what makes a nation strong isn't what shines, it's what stands still under pressure. Most legacies are carved in stone. Lee's lives in motion, in trains that run on time, in water that's always clean, in hands that still build, and minds that still ask, what would he do now? Because some leaders leave, others linger in the rhythm of a nation. Lee admired the West, but never copied it. He blended British structure, Chinese discipline, and Southeast Asian realism. He said, "We can modernize without westernizing." Singapore wasn't a clone. It was a new formula, rooted in its region, but built for the world. Like Churchill, Lee led during collapse and rebirth. Both spoke in absolutes. Both stood alone, then led millions. But while Churchill saved an empire, Lee built a nation from ruins. One fought war, the other fought irrelevance, and both won. Deng Xiaoping studied Lee's model. He asked, "How did you do it without chaos?" Lee replied, "Rule firmly, but fairly." Parts of China's rise bear his fingerprints, not as an architect, but as an influence they couldn't ignore. Lee forgave disagreement. He accepted resistance. But one thing made him furious: laziness. If you worked under him, you moved fast, you studied deep, or you were gone. He didn't build with the loud. He built with the reliable. Critics asked, "Where's your freedom?" Lee asked back, "Where's your clean water? Where's your safety?" To him, rights were real when people felt secure, not when slogans were shouted. He didn't reject freedom. He just demanded responsibility with it. Lee never governed by polls. He said, if you're always liked, you're not doing enough. Popularity fades, but consequences last. He wanted long-term respect, not applause, and he earned it in quiet, irreversible ways. Lee never spoke down to the poor. He walked their streets. He knew their fears, because a nation isn't its elites. It's its bus drivers, its cleaners, its hawkers. He said, "Raise their dignity, and the country rises with them." When Lee signed new laws, he didn't just use a pen. He thought of the next 30 years, of children unborn, of problems unspoken. Because a real leader signs not with ink, but with accountability. To Asia, Lee offered an example. You can be efficient without being Western. You can be modern without selling your soul. And your voice matters, even if your country is small. He gave hope to every quiet nation with a loud dream. What would Lee do today? Faced with AI, climate change, division, he wouldn't panic. He'd prepare. Because his method wasn't magic. It was clarity, discipline, and courage. And maybe those are still the tools we all need most. Look in the mirror. If you're disciplined, if you think long-term, if you refuse shortcuts, Lee is alive in you. His legacy isn't carved in marble. It walks in footsteps. It moves in choices. It breathes in habits. In 2015, Singapore wept. But the real ending didn't come with flowers. It came with renewal, with children raised in clean streets, with leaders thinking decades ahead. Lee didn't build forever. He built for those who would. He was never just a politician. He was a teacher, a strategist, a father of systems, and above all, a man who believed that small can be mighty if it stands tall enough. Lee made mistakes. He admitted them. He could be harsh. He could be cold. But in a world of sweet words and broken promises, he chose results. Not perfect, but real. He built in his time. Now it's ours. Not to imitate, but to create. To build with the same spirit. Clean, sharp, kind. The question isn't, will there be another Lee? It's, will we carry the torch? Even now, Singapore runs quietly. No chaos, no collapse. That silence? That's Lee. Still here, not in words, but in the hum of MRT trains, in the rhythm of responsibility. He often asked, what kind of people do we want to be? Not rich or powerful, but disciplined, resilient, unshaken. Because the future isn't built with easy answers. It's built by asking the right questions. Leadership isn't command, it's commitment. It's showing up when it rains, when no one's watching, when the applause fades. That's what Lee taught, not by theory, but by showing up every single day. It's not flags, not slogans. It's character, grit, a refusal to surrender. Singapore was never meant to thrive, but it did. Because its people, like its founder, believed that greatness is a decision you make every day. One man believed a swamp could become a symbol. One island proved that size is nothing without soul. And one idea, that discipline, courage, and vision can move history. This wasn't just Lee Kuan Yew's story, it's ours now.